welcome everybody. My name is Mark Hansen. I'm the interim director of the Practical Ethics Center, and welcome to PEC Presents. Before we get started, I just want to alert you all to the final talk in our series for the spring term. On May 3rd, Deborah Slicer, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the university, she teaches environmental ethics. She'll be talking about the title, Moral Vegetarianism, What's Love Got to Do with It? So I hope you'll be able to stop back and listen to her talk. Today we're very happy, privileged to have with us Hank Fischer. Hank is currently works as Special Projects Coordinator for the World National Wildlife Federation. From 1977 till 2002, he covered the Northern Rockies for Defenders of Wildlife. He's been intensely involved in endangered species restoration, particularly with efforts in dealing with wolves, grizzly bears, and black-footed ferrets. He was a leader in a 10-year effort to restore wolves to Yellowstone National Park in central Idaho. He chronicled this conservation effort in a 1995 book, Wolf Wars, which I encourage you to pick up. More recently, he led a collaborative effort between conservationists and the timber industry and organized labor to restore grizzly bears to central Idaho. He has an MS in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana, author of dozens of natural resource articles for more than a decade, was a regular commentary on Montana Public Radio, received numerous awards, and he's also the author of the Paddler's Guide to Montana. So we're happy to have him with us today.
Well, thanks a bunch. I'm pleased to be part of this seminar. Now, at the same time, I've got to confess, I have a little trepidation wading into these weighty matters of philosophy and ethics. I see all these heads bulging with ideas out there, and I'll have to see if I'm... it puts a ton of pressure on me to make a good impression, so I was trying to think, okay, what could I do here to get your attention right off the bat? Well, first I thought, well, I could set up a live webcam to Yellowstone Park and focus it on the den site of the Druid Peak Wolf Pack, and can I cue the cameraman back? No, I decided not to do that. I decided, okay, this is an intellectual audience. So what I really need to do is to challenge them right off the bat. So here's my effort to do that. This is what I'm going to talk about today. Can anybody tell me what these are? 2 dimes that I'm moving back and forth. Yes, yes. Shifting paradigms. Okay. The old paradigm is that ranchers and environmentalists are constantly in pitched warfare, and that the only common ground they can ever find is the dirt that they throw at each other. And in the new paradigm, ranchers and environmentalists work together to find constructive solutions that abet both wildlife and livestock. I suspect if you've heard anything about environmental ethics previously, it's probably been from a corporate point of view or from a public policy perspective. And I'd like to talk today about environmental ethics from the point of view of a person who's been intensely involved in conservation issues as a professional conservationist for the last 25 years. And specifically, I have 2 things that I want to talk to you about today. And first is, do environmentalists have any obligation to consider the economic distress and subsequent social upheaval that they might cause? And second, are there specific approaches to solving environmental problems that are less polarizing and that lend themselves to better solutions? But just to make sure as we start out here that we're all on the same page, I wanted to lay out briefly some of the basic parameters of endangered species protection. Congress passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973. There were only a handful of dissenting votes. At that time, it was extremely popular legislation. By passing this law, Congress made protection of endangered species an important national priority. The law is straightforward, it's unequivocal. It does 2 very important things. First of all, it requires federal agencies to refrain from taking any action that will jeopardize listed species. But secondly, it does something even more important than that. It requires agencies to take affirmative actions to recover species. In other words, it's not good enough just that the species stay at the point where they are. Federal agencies are obliged to take positive actions to get endangered species off the list. And I recite this to you because I want you to understand that protecting endangered species in this country isn't something that is optional. It's not something just to be done if it's convenient. It's not something to do just because it's the right thing to do. It's no more optional than paying taxes or not stopping at stop signs. So while there's little flexibility in whether or not we protect endangered species in this country, where there is a lot of flexibility is how we go about doing it. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. What this all means is that our elected officials have provided conservationists with an extremely powerful tool for conserving species. And when you have such a strong law at your disposal, it's imperative to act wisely or Congress may choose to take it away. And certainly right now, Congress is talking about taking parts of the Endangered Species Act away from conservationists. But let's leave the policy world for a minute and get back to the part that I understand better, and that's actually how conservation works on the ground. And what I thought I might do is to take you back to 1984, which was in the early stages of when people were even beginning to think about Yellowstone wolf restoration, and tell you a little bit about what was going on then. I was working for Defenders of Wildlife at that point. It was plain to me that livestock producers were going to be the alpha opponents of wolf restoration. They were the ones who had the most to lose. And as looking at a map of the Yellowstone Park area, what was interesting to me was that that there were so few people who were potentially affected by wolf restoration. Even though it's a large area with public land grazing around Yellowstone Park, when I looked at it, there were probably only about 150 individuals that were potentially affected by wolf restoration. Well, I got to thinking about this, and what I thought is, geez, it would be physically possible to meet with every one of these people. And, call me naive, but I thought if I could meet with every one of these ranchers, I would get a much better idea of what their concerns were, and in my mind, then be able to craft some solutions that might be more responsive to those concerns. So I went up and I set up 4 different meetings around Yellowstone Park. And this wasn't as hard as you think. You get the records of who has grazing leases and you send them out invites and there you go. Well, there I go. The first meeting I had was in St. Anthony, Idaho. And, I was driving down there, and as I was driving down, I started thinking, well, maybe this wasn't such a smart idea. It's like inviting yourself to your own lynching. And I pulled up to this little schoolhouse in St. Anthony, Idaho. And, as I pulled up, I could see this sea of cowboy hats inside this school. And I thought, this might not be so good. And even worse, when I got inside, I saw that one of the people inside was this old sheep producer that I'd had a lot of run-ins previously with. And so this wasn't going to go well. So undaunted, I went in, I called the meeting to order, I introduced myself, and I barely got my name out, and the old sheep herder stands up in the back and says, "Hank Fischer, nobody's killed you yet?" And now, everybody's just started laughing, of course, and it was actually a friendly little taunt, and it was just sort of to affirm, our roles as adversaries. But I have to say, I took it more as a signal that they were willing to give me a chance and to hear me out on what I had to say. And I went along, and I started out on the easy stuff that, wolves are easier to manage than grizzly bears, because their reproductive rate's higher, and, you don't have to worry about individual animals as much. And, they were okay on that. But it was just a matter of time before we got into the whole thing of livestock losses. And So I sort of started off by talking about livestock loss rates in Minnesota and in Canada, and the statistics say that they're just a fraction of 1%, and and I barely get that out of my mouth, and they started, and just one after another they got up, and the whole thing about this is only a fraction of 1%. The guy asked me, "Son, have you ever heard about the guy who drowned in the river that averaged 6 inches deep?" And they sort of took their turns one after another, and actually it was my old sheep producer friend who probably said it best. And what he said is, it's easy to be a wolf lover. It doesn't cost anything. All of you want wolves, and that's fine, but who actually has to pay for any of this? And actually the costs of this end up being placed on the few of us who raise livestock. And I said, well, but there's in Minnesota they have this compensation program that's run by the state, and that we're hoping that there might be a compensation program out here too. And I remember he said to me, hope is a mighty fine breakfast, but it's a lousy supper. And I left this whole meeting realizing that I had a long ways to go to be able to be successful in presenting wolf recovery as something that was viable in this region. And I realized that there were a lot of their questions that I couldn't answer very well. Actually, a few months later, I had a meeting with the new director of the National Park Service. And again, this was 1984. Reagan had just trounced Walter Mondale soundly, and you probably remember that Reagan had appointed some pretty nasty people to Interior Department positions, like James Watt, people like that. And this National Park Service director was his old state parks guy from California, and everybody thought he was just going to be as awful as the rest of them. Well, it turns out that this guy, I have to tell you about him because he was such an interesting guy. He was kind of like Reagan. He was in his late 70s, and he was really energetic and talkative. His name was Bill Mott. Well, he turned out that he was a big wolf supporter. He said, restoring wolves to Yellowstone, it's the right thing to do. It's the only animal missing in the ecosystem. And the whole time I was in there meeting with him, he's walking around the room, and he's waving his arms, and he was just animated and excited. And he told me, and he was sort of like this zany professor type, but and just sort of out of the blue, he gave me this piece of advice, and I have to say it's the best piece of advice anybody's ever given me on wolves. And he said that the single most important thing that conservation groups could do to get wolves back in Yellowstone was to start a compensation fund. He says, it's economics that makes people hate wolves. Pay ranchers for their losses, and the controversy will subside. So I took all that to heart, and I took it back to my organization and started talking to them about it. And there was a ton of resistance. First of all, it was give money to ranchers. These people are our enemies. They hate wolves. They're the ones who make all the trouble for wolves. They kill wolves when they can. Why would we give them money? There's a total disconnect, and I have to say it's a disconnect that's still out there in a lot of the conservation world. The other part was, we don't know how much these losses are going to cost. This program could bankrupt us. And of course, the flip side of that is, are we unwilling to take a risk that we're asking somebody else to take? That's exactly what the ranchers are saying to us, is that as we tell them that losses are only going to be 1%, well, they don't believe it. Well, here I was getting the same thing from my own people, that we weren't willing to take the risk because it might be a lot higher. So, needless to say, we didn't set up a compensation program right away. But what happened was I think it would have been just in the next year, in 1986, wolves started coming back to Montana on their own in northwestern Montana in the Glacier Park area. And there were just a few wolves, just a couple packs of wolves at that time. One of them was on the east side of the Rockies over by Browning. They started killing livestock. And it was really a tough call because there's so few wolves. They were an endangered species. The agencies didn't quite know what to do. Ranchers were getting very upset because they were starting to lose a lot of livestock. It was a mess. And those of you who were around then might remember it was in the papers on a daily basis. It was very inflammatory. The way it ended up was they ended up killing most of the wolves. Really didn't do much good because everybody was so alienated at that point that a lot of the damage was done. And we really saw that this was hurting efforts to think about restoring wolves to Yellowstone and central Idaho if this was the outcome. So I went back to defenders and said, the only way we could help out this situation would be to compensate these ranchers who've lost their livestock, and let's do it on just a one-time basis and see what happens. And so we ended up sending out a letter to some of our Montana members. It was about, as I remember, about $3,000 or $4,000 worth of livestock. Well, the response we got was tremendous. I mean, within 48 hours, we had the money from our members to compensate these ranchers. And so we did. And what was interesting about it was how quickly the controversy dissipated. And it was a pretty important lesson for us as to how assuming economic responsibility for wolves made a big difference in the public perception of whether ranchers were being treated fairly or not. So after that, Defenders of Wildlife established a permanent fund in 1990. And as most of you probably know, reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone and to central Idaho took place in 1993 and 1994. Now, one of the key points with the reintroduction, there was a lawsuit filed as the wolves were being reintroduced. And in fact, one of the Farm Bureau attempted to stop the reintroduction, to get an injunction to stop the reintroduction. The judge denied that injunction, and he said that the reason he denied it was because there was a compensation program. And he said that without it, he would have stopped the reintroduction because there was too much chance for economic hardship if there hadn't been a program in place. So since the compensation program was started, conservationists have paid out approximately $360,000 to about 300 different ranchers. And so you might ask, well, okay, what are some of the lessons of this? And I guess the first thing I'd say is that even though our laws don't require environmentalists to pay attention to social upheaval or economic distress, we have a responsibility to try to minimize these impacts just as much as we can. When ranchers argued to me that it wasn't fair for them to take on the economic burden of wolves, I found that something I couldn't respond to. Because here, when you think about it, here's society that has decided it wants to maintain this species, and yet the costs of that recovery are really placed on a very small segment of the public. And in fact, the people who most want to see wolves restored basically have a free ride on it. It doesn't cost them anything. And so I think shifting the economic costs of wolf restoration away from livestock producers and toward the millions of people in this country that want to see wolves restored really made a big difference. The other thing I'd say, it was plain to me that being responsive to the legitimate concerns of people affected by endangered species not only is the right thing to do, but it's the it's one of the most effective means of creating a durable public policy solution. In other words, to develop solutions that last a long time, you need to have buy-in from both sides. And I think when you get into the whole arena of taking a more collaborative approach, you're more likely to develop a solution that lasts for the long time. While I would say that economic concerns come first for most ranchers, I would also say that this compensation experience has a critical social component to it as well. Paying compensation, for one, is a recognition that raising livestock is a legitimate enterprise, and that causing economic hardship to a business like this is something that does need to be taken seriously. And I say that because many ranchers feel like most environmentalists, their goal is just to put them out of business, and that they really don't have much concern for their struggle to make a living. And I'd have to say on the other side of the fence, the compensation program put conservation leaders in constant touch with affected members of the livestock industry. And I mean, during the 15 years or so that I managed Defender's compensation program, I probably talked to hundreds of ranchers, and many of them were the ranchers who had most reason to be disaffected about wolf recovery. They were people who had verified wolf losses. And yet most of the time I found that these people weren't particularly embittered about it. They weren't even necessarily anti-wolf. I would bet that half of the people that I talked to were, at some point in our conversations told me that they were willing to have wolves around, that they didn't oppose having wolves around, but that they just couldn't afford the livestock losses. And so I guess that makes me feel as though compensation really did make a difference to them. To the extent we can take care of the economic problem, we begin to build some acceptance. So I am going to stop there and give all of you a chance to perhaps ask a few questions, and I can go on into some other areas as well, but I thought I'd give you a chance to ask anything you might have. Mm-hmm.
I really like your argument. I'm wondering if it goes the other way, that is, that there's ways in which to involve ranchers, because they do have a special relationship with the land. Flora, is that her name? Was talking about how there's actually been ranchers on large areas along the Eastern Front who on their own took about the task of helping out grizzly bears. Do you work with ranchers in that regard, not only in terms of economic consequences, but in terms of a sort of social practice of conservation that's practiced on both sides of that divide?
Yeah, I mean, we have. I mean, one of the other programs that we started after this compensation program was, what we started looking at is, okay, we've sort of achieved our goal of getting wolves back into, Yellowstone National Park, into the big central Idaho wilderness areas, but it was really our expectation to have wolves and bears more broadly distributed across the landscape in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And we had a recognition that if we were going to have these animals in areas where they hadn't been before, it's likely that livestock producers were going to have to make some changes in the way they did their operations. Now, we thought it as an issue of fairness, if you're asking people to change their practices, and it may mean, I'm talking about things like maybe having livestock guarding dogs, of securing particularly with sheep, securing your sheep at night, doing your lambing within electric fencing. I mean, those sorts of things all have a cost associated with them. And is it fair for us to expect these people to pay all the costs of these animals that we want to put out in places where they haven't been before? I don't think so. And at the same time, I think every landowner has some responsibility to take care of wildlife that is on their property. So what we decided to do was to meet them halfway on that. And this was sort of an outgrowth of the compensation program. If somebody had livestock losses, more than once or twice, I would typically talk to them and say, do you have any ideas on something that we could do that would prevent these losses from happening in the first place? And lots of times they did have good ideas for it, some of the things that I've mentioned. And so what we would do in those cases is we would pay for half of the cost of those improvements. And we call this the Proactive Carnivore Conservation Fund. And I think Defenders has spent over $200,000 on it now. And I think that begins to really develop more of a relationship. And plus you get great ideas. I mean, one thing I remember plainly, geez, it's probably been 10 years ago now, there was a rancher down in the Bitterroot by Florence who had a problem with wolves killing his calves right at calving time. Every year he was having problems. That was the only time of year he had problems, but he had it on a routine basis. And so I was having this conversation with him one year, and he says to me, geez, is there any way that you could do those radio collars on the wolves so that when they approached my livestock, it would set off some kind of an alarm? Because it's sort of a standard preventative procedure to have noisemakers, but they just go off sort of at regular intervals. But this guy said, well, geez, couldn't the radio collar on these wolves trigger an alarm as they were approaching the animals? And geez, I was sort of thinking about it, and yeah, that seemed technically feasible. So I called up somebody with the Denver Wildlife Research Center. He said, oh yeah, that's possible. And well, I said, could we put something like that together? And so we ended up contributing about $10,000 and developed this prototype of a remote activated livestock guarding device. And it did exactly what the rancher had suggested. What was cool was when the wolves came up, this little box would had all these recordings, and it would have sort of helicopter noises and guns blazing and bad country music, I mean, all kinds of stuff. But what they found was that it was pretty effective at, wolves are pretty skittish animals, and it was quite effective at keeping them away. And in fact, this whole remote activated livestock guarding device got so that now it's used all over Montana and Idaho and Wyoming. It's pretty standard part of the repertoire. So yes, I think there are lots of room for working with livestock producers, particularly once you get in that whole relationship of we're both trying to figure this out together rather than you're the problem, and if we just got rid of you, everything would be fine.
So that really it's not just about social upheaval, it's about reconstituting a social loop. That's the bigger one.
Yeah, I think so. I think where you start developing that more constructive relationship where you're trying to figure out together how to solve a problem. And what it takes, though, it also takes getting the livestock people to the point where they get off, their mantra of, no wolves, no way. And I think you'll find a lot of practical people in the livestock industry who realize that wolves are here, they're here to stay, and that those people who just say, let's get rid of them all are, out to lunch. But there's still a lot of people in the livestock industry who feel that way, and I think it drags down the more progressive part of the industry.
Is there enough compensation applied to losses on public grazing and things like that as well?
It does. It's on public land as well as private land.
Okay. So that was always an issue that bothered me.
Because?
Because if you're grazing on public land, it's not your own, and you're giving your chief allotments to do that. How can you complain about losses from wildlife when you have all kinds of other animals out there too? It's livestock depredation. This is part of the ranch.
Well, I think it's a fair. I think what you bring up is a fair consideration. But if you were a person grazing on public land, and you had to sustain constant losses, I guess it would make it uneconomical for you to do that. The way we've tried to get at that problem is, and actually it's the project that I'm working on now with the National Wildlife Federation, is sort of the third iteration of these approaches to solving carnivore problems has been to look at these public land allotments that have chronic conflict with wolves and bears. And what we're trying to do on those is on the places where there's continual conflict, let's say we've paid compensation, we've tried these proactive measures, and they still have problems. What we try to do is to retire the allotments. And that's where we offer an economic incentive to that producer to retire that allotment. We also work with the agencies to where they don't graze that anymore. They go through their NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act procedures to retire the allotments. Frequently then what we do is we secure another allotment for the producer in a place where there aren't conflicts with large carnivores. And that's sort of been the approach because, again, I think if you have one of these livestock grazing allotments, it's something you've paid for. It does have value. Now, we can argue about whether they're paying enough, and I'm obviously in your camp on that. But still, it's something that they pay for and that they have a legal right to. So, we developed that. We had that problem at the beginning too, but we decided if people are having livestock losses, we'd compensate for them no matter where they occur. The only change that Defenders has made to that is that they no longer compensate in primary grizzly bear habitat. In Situation 1 grizzly bear habitat, they won't compensate now.
You were talking about the risk involved in setting up a compensation fund, as a on behalf of a nonprofit organization. It seems to me that especially when you're talking about public lands like a national park, that ought to be that the efforts to preserve wildlife within a national park and the consequences of that in terms of the surrounding area ought to be a national or a federal obligation. And because it's a public land and it's a public good, and there may be these additional costs associated with it, but it seems to me that the obligation really ought to be at least insured by the state or by the federal government. Is there any movement on that?
Now, it's interesting you bring that up because we thought about that, and that was one of the big points of debate internally. Geez, shouldn't we just try to make this a federal compensation program? Shouldn't we lobby Congress to create a program like that? And I got to say, I really nixed that. I just said that, the amount of time and energy that we would have to put into lobbying to create a federal compensation program, we could pay for it 10 times over. And it was so much easier to do it ourselves. And in some ways, there's a little bit more equality to it as well, of really having the people who are most vociferous about wanting wolves restored having to pay for it. The judge in the wolf case actually said that. He said, it's refreshing to see conservationists put their money where their mouth is. And I think a lot of people, feel that way, that the directness of that exchange of having wolf advocates have to pay for the damage, there's really some balancing there that is powerful. And I don't, I'm enough of a libertarian to think that, expecting the government to take care of every problem isn't necessarily the best way to go either. In some ways, the private sector can be pretty efficient. We have so much less paperwork in doing this compensation program. I think we were able to have a much more efficient program. We were able to make the payments a lot quicker. It was easier, and I guess people think of the government as being a more dependable funding source. I'm not sure that's the case. Our program has been incredibly successful and effective at raising funds. We've always had strong support from the public in terms of paying for this program. So, I really feel like having it be a private program ended up being one of the real strengths of it. Although I think you accurately point out a lot of concerns that livestock producers had too, of they didn't see our program as secure as a governmental program. And probably they felt less ability to influence it And that's sort of up to us, though, to make sure that they do have the ability to influence the program. And I guess one thing I would say is that we made changes to our program right off the bat at the request of the livestock industry. You know, one of the things they complained about at the beginning was that we paid market value for livestock. Well, they said, geez, if a calf gets killed in the spring when it's only a few weeks old, you know, its market value is very low, but we have all of our investment into that animal already. It doesn't cost us that much to take that, you know, animal into the fall once it's alive and healthy. And so we began paying them fall prices for any calves or lambs that were killed in the springtime. We paid fall prices. They also argued that you know, sometimes we didn't know for sure whether a wolf killed a calf. We couldn't be sure. And to account for that, we created a part of our program where we called it a probable loss rather than a confirmed loss. In other words, where there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but the people doing the verification couldn't be sure. And we paid them at a 50% rate instead of at a 100% rate. And I think that answered a lot of concerns. So I think we have tried to be responsive to livestock industry concerns, but, you know, some people are just uneasy about dealing with conservation groups, and they're more comfortable in dealing with the government.
As that process unfolded, how did you have those dialogues that led to decisions that defenders would make? Like the example you just used about increasing the compensation for the calves. Did you have a council or a coalition of some sort that brought the issues to the table from the livestock industry and from defenders where those decisions would then get made? Or just from a process perspective, how did it work as the program kept going?
Well, the way it usually worked is, I guess I'm sort of the sieve for hearing what people were thinking about the program, either livestock producers or livestock industry people, or, you know, just the things that you'd see in the newspaper and the letters to the editor column that people were complaining about. And I mean, I think you have to be sensitive to those and feel like, okay, at what point are you hearing that, and is that resonating enough that you need to respond to it? And, you know, at that point, you know, if I felt there was something that was significant enough that we needed to consider a change, then I would recommend it back to our DC office, and usually that was, you know, that was fairly pro forma after that, as long as it didn't cost a ton.
And we kind of had a little conversation about this previously, but and you're extraordinarily pragmatic and you solve some real problems. But part of the reason it worked is because a significant portion of the population believes, for whatever reason, that there's meaning in wolves and in trees and forests and rivers. But at some point, what happens when that conflict is so great that people say, you know, I just as soon have plastic trees. I won't know the difference between a plastic tree and a real tree. And so take it down, put up plastic trees. What's the meaning in wolves that makes it compelling enough that organizations such as yourself would work hard and compensate out of your own pocket to make sure that they're there?
Well, I mean, I think I know what you're getting at, and that we constantly have a problem where, you know, we're trying to balance being responsive to other parts of society who, you know, that wolves may cause problems for, and then some of our own members who really think, you know, who see wolves pretty narrowly and think wolves should be protected under every circumstance, and that us doing anything less than completely protecting wolves is not doing what we should be doing. And I really see that as in part an educational issue on our part of, I think what we have to do is to explain to people how wolves sometimes do cause problems, unacceptable problems to people. And that we have to be responsive to that, or if we aren't responsive to that, we really risk, you know, not having any wolf population at all. And I contrast that to, you know, some of the conservation efforts in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, where, as I read, the conservation groups have taken a much harder edge with the livestock industry, and there hasn't been as much collaboration. And they have a lot more illegal killing down there. They have a lot less tolerance for their program. I mean, and you may think, well, geez, things aren't going so swimmingly up here with all the things you read in the paper all the time, and there's a lot of negative commentary on a regular basis. But a lot of that is just blowing off steam up here. I mean, we don't have nearly the level of illegal killing. We have really a pretty good acceptance of wolves, and a lot, you know, in many parts of the state. And Montana's been a particularly good place. It's been a lot tougher in Idaho and way tougher in Wyoming, but Montana's been quite good, and I think our state wildlife agency has played a real leadership role in promoting acceptance of wolves with hunters and with livestock people. But you know, there's a balance that you have to strike with your own membership, because we would get that ourselves frequently, of that you're not doing enough for wolves, you're too concerned about ranchers. I mean, I remember getting a nasty letter from one of our members about how, you know, I had turned this organization into defenders of livestock. And so you don't please everybody.
Recently had some predictions about the rate of livestock killings after introduction, and it was higher or lower, or it was pretty precise?
You know, it really has been fairly close to what has been predicted. But, you know, I guess if there's anything, you know, something I've learned over doing this the last 15 years is that those statistics aren't that important. The guy at that meeting was absolutely right, because, you know, some of these ranchers can drown in a river that's 6 inches deep. You know, some ranchers do have significant livestock losses, and if there weren't some sort of compensation program for them, it would have very significant economic impacts, which, I mean, you got to understand what would happen. I mean, if that weren't in place, what would be happening now is you would have some ranchers that are really losing a fair amount of livestock. And they would go to our congressional delegation and they would start complaining, and our congressional delegation, to the extent they felt it was pushing somebody out of business, would really come on strong. But because these people are being insulated from really serious economic hardship, you know, the congressional delegations don't give this the attention that they would. But I think without a compensation program, we would have a ton more controversy than we have. And, you know, it has moderated that a lot, because in my mind, it is the economics that drives this issue. You know, it's that, and I don't know, you know, you have to put yourself, I don't know if any of you have raised a garden and have your tomatoes decimated by some pest, and you were thinking, geez, I really didn't like pesticides much, but now all of a sudden I'm starting to like them a little more. I mean, I think you have to put yourself in the position of a rancher who, you know, this is what he raises to support his family, and when things are tough and he's losing a lot of livestock, you know, it's pretty tough. So, you know, I think you have to be able to put yourself in their shoes.
Do you ever have livestock people say, but just the fact that the wolves predate so much on my herd, for example, is itself unacceptable, and it's not just an economic issue, it's an issue of somehow the destructiveness itself, or does that just go...
Well, yeah, no, there is that. I mean, some people say that, and I think it's true. I mean, they argue that, okay, now what you're paying for is one part of my loss, and that's the actual loss of the animal. What you're not paying me for is all the extra time that I have to spend because my livestock are scattered to hell and gone because these wolves are chasing them around. It's not taking into account the amount of weight that my livestock are losing because they're being chased around by wolves. And those are real issues. And
But not just a gut reaction, I don't like things that kill things.
oh yeah, I mean, there's that. I mean, geez, I think of Joe Helly down in Dillon, who's a sheep producer, and for years he was head of the Wool Growers Association, and his mantra was, you know, I don't raise livestock to be compensated for them. I raise them to sell them. And that being said, we've only had one livestock producer who has refused compensation. So, you know, they are willing to use the program. But sure, we hear some of those complaints. Mm-hmm.
Is these kinds of efforts in collaboration and sort of multi-stakeholder conversations to try and solve problems, is there a trend in the wider field that is going more and more to solve problems in this way? Are we getting better and more creative at these types of management issues, or is there no trend, or have we taken a step backwards in terms of the conservation laws in the country now?
Well, I mean, I hope I'm not being just a wishful thinker, but I believe that, yeah, there is a real trend toward collaboration. I think there's a trend toward collaboration because it's effective. And as I mentioned, I think it does create more durable solutions. I have to say I'm chagrined sometimes that the trend isn't stronger than it is, because I don't know, it just takes a long time working in the conservation field to come around to really, I mean, I don't know. When you first get started doing conservation, there's a lot of it that is sort of a you against them thing, and it's, it's if you're, they're the bad guys, we're the good guys, and I think that's sort of endemic to the nonprofit world in general. But after you do that a while, you realize, no, things are way more complicated than that, and that isn't the way you solve problems. I don't know. We were very involved in this major collaboration effort to restore grizzly bears to central Idaho that we worked with the timber industry and organized labor on, and I felt like that was a terrific collaboration effort. And I always felt like, okay, if we got the timber industry and organized labor to agree grizzly bears ought to be in Idaho, it would happen. Well, that was the interesting thing. It turned out that no, even some of the political leaders were unwilling to go with it just because they were so fearful of consequences. So, collaboration is trickier than you think, too, and it doesn't mean that you get to the finish line just because you're collaborating. So, but my own prediction is that we'll see more, and I think we're all better for it. Thanks.